Hello friends, old and new, welcome back to the channel. It's been a long time since the last video. Actually, this watch we're looking at now is new when we did the last video, so it's been a while. But join me for working on this fabulous Juvenia with a Venus 175 inside. So let's have a little bit closer look at this watch. It's just a fabulous dial. If you're into vintage watches, this is basically the kind of dial you would die for. Just very unique, very nice patina and a bit of a mottled pattern. It's also made out of butterfly dust, which isn't ideal for handling it, so we have to be very careful with it. See, the case is actually in very good condition. Two types of finishes, brushed on the sides and polished elsewhere. So we're not really going to do anything with the case. What we will have a look at though is how it runs. We always like seeing parallel stripes, but the beat error is pretty bad. So we're going to have to do something about that. We see the amplitude is also very low. So we do have some work ahead. So we're going to start by taking off the crystal and then removing the hands. And the reason we do that is that these old watches don't have typical dial screws. They were fastened with so-called dog screws. And these dog screws are not on the side of the movement, like normal dial screws, but rather on the underside of the movement. So we're going to put the crystal back in and protect the dial that way while we take off the case back. And there we have it. A wonderful Venus 175. Now Venus was one of the very best manufacturers of chronograph movements. Now most watch lovers have probably heard about Venus movements. The 175 and the 178, which we are going to look at in a video in couple of months. Beautiful movements, design sort of taken directly from the textbook of chronographs, or perhaps the other way around. 7-column wheel or pillar wheel, which makes it very, very smooth to operate. Venus actually did make a few watches as well, but they're really known for their movements. Of course, brands like Juvenia would use these movements and then create the rest of the watch themselves. We're gonna keep the movement inside the case as we start stripping down the chronograph parts. It's a pretty logical sequencing of this. First thing we do is remove all the pressure, the strain, so basically the springs, and then we can start taking the various parts out. Gonna do this in rather quick succession. Spend a little bit more time as we build the watch up again. But as mentioned, it's pretty much a textbook horizontal clutch chronograph. And a beautiful one at that. One thing to be careful with is this chronograph bridge. They are always very tight, and you don't want them to flip up and break off pivots. And here we have the column wheel. If we look a little bit closer, we can see that this is actually not very easy to machine. That's also why these movements are less common than the cam shifted ones. Cams can be basically just pressed out of a metal plate, while these column wheels are pretty difficult to manufacture. Got this beautiful dial off in one piece. Let's just put it away safely together with the hands. For some reason there was a lot of oil under this chronograph plate. And this part that we're taking off here is something you wouldn't normally take off. It's the chariot or the carriage for the minute jumper. Only reason we take it off is because we have to adjust that jumper anyway. But if you don't have to, you shouldn't mess with the alignment of the jumpers, the eccentric screws and so forth. So the last part of the chronograph movement is the driving wheel. I'm going to use a special tool for taking that off. Normally we would have taken this off earlier, but due to the difficulty with the dial, I chose to wait a little bit with this one, so that we don't risk breaking that extended pivot on the fourth wheel. Now we see curiously that this escape wheel cock is really worn. The plating on the top side has pretty much all come off. So you can see the brass almost completely. So we're going to have to do something about that. We can then disassemble the base movement. No real surprises there, apart from a screw hiding in there. But a lot of oil again. Not quite as much as in a Pobjeda watch we did before, but certainly enough to run a moped for a, let's say, medium distance. Like maybe, I don't know, back and forth to the grocery store. As long as you don't buy too much food so it gets too heavy. I will see this setting lever spring / plate. Also some oil under there, so these wheels stick on it. There's not a lot of old oil or gunk in the movement. But apart from these puddles of oil, it's pretty much dry. Getting close to finishing the strip down. Now we're going to clean the parts, and some parts need more cleaning than others. The setting lever is pretty dirty. Some more oil. Before we put the parts into the cleaning machine, we run over the jewel holes with a pegwood. We put the balance back on so that the hairspring is protected. And time for some manicure work. So I think between this and working on cuticles, I'd rather do this. Well, I am doing this, so I guess that's the reason. But of course, if your watchmaker career doesn't really pan out, then I'm sure there are some Korean nail salons that could use some help. By the way, I mentioned before, you can get 100 of these pegwood sticks on eBay for like $2, including shipping. Alright, let's crack the barrel open. And here we get a little bit of a nasty surprise. Yes, it's dirty and it's a little bit worn. That's pretty much just the plating, so that's all right. But what is quite interesting, let's look at the end of the mainspring. This is not factory made. This is a watchmaker who basically fixed the mainspring, riveted a piece of old mainspring on the end of the broken one. For the barrel, we're going to do the nail test, fingernail that is, since we're in the cuticle business anyway. Basically, we're going to try to scratch the nail over the barrel, and if we feel resistance, then we need to do something about it. Here it's basically just cosmetic. For the clutch and the wheel, we check it briefly with the dust blower. And we see it doesn't really revolve too freely, so we're gonna take that apart as well. And at this point you might ask yourself, hey, what happened to the sound? All of a sudden this guy's like 1 octave lower. Well, friends, that's what the cold does to you every now and then. It is the day after, and clearing up my throat apparently also cleared up my sexy voice. Hoo-yah! Alright, let's clean up the last remaining parts a little bit. Then let's see what we've got. Well, it does seem we have a bucket load of parts, and they are in generally pretty good condition. A little bit staining here and there, nothing serious, so we can reuse almost all of this, no problem. Alright, let's get all the parts into the basket and head off to the cleaning machine. It's always so nice to have someone or something else do work for you. But now it's time for us to work again. So with all the parts cleaned, we're going to put in a new, or rather quite old mainspring. Given that this is a manual winding watch, we don't have to lubricate the walls of the barrel. But we'll put a little bit oil at the bottom and the top. Not too much. We don't want the coils to stick together either. So I recently bought pretty much the entire collection of great illustrated classics. So my son and I, we've been reading Robin Hood, we read The Three Musketeers, and just yesterday we started reading Oliver Twist. And for those of you who haven't read it for a while or thought of it for a while, it's a very sorry tale about this little boy, 9 years old, and is forced to learn a trade. And I want to try to make him become an undertaker or a chimney sweeper. So luckily my son turned to warn me and said, hey, when can we continue working on the watches? Because he and I, we started disassembling this good old Unitas 6497 a little while ago. We never really completed reassembling it. But I think this is kind of the beauty of working with watches. It's so timeless, ironically, that you can work on the same watches that people did, well, basically a couple 100 years ago. Coming back to this one, after oiling the stones, we see the balance moves very nicely. That's good to see. And of course, as we started talking a little bit about, Venus was a very high quality manufacturer, especially their column wheel chronographs. So this one, the 175, but also the 178, for instance, very famous, very sought after even today. Used in a lot of very high quality, high cost watches. But that was also a little bit of their problem. They just didn't generate enough profit. So they also started making some lower cost cam switched chronographs. But ultimately they were absorbed by Valjoux, which of course were again absorbed by the Swatch Group. So the skills and the knowledge still lives on, but the Venus movements themselves are basically just in older pieces like this one. So we're gonna test the watch first, that everything runs nicely and smoothly, that the keyless works work. So we're going to put this escape wheel cock back on, that brass looking cock. And then we're going to deal with the color afterwards. So in the keyless works, we use quite a lot of grease. Basically where metal rubs against metal, we use grease. We use D5 or HP 1300 or similar on the posts. So the main difference is the answer to the question, does it rotate or does it rub? If it rubs, we use grease. If it rotates, we typically use an oil. And oils and greases are actually more or less the same thing. It's just a question of viscosity. At some point we start calling it the grease, when it's thick enough basically. The keyless works on this watch is very straightforward. Also pretty much textbook. I'm starting to think actually the Venus guys wrote the textbooks on these kinds of movements. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about the textbook, I basically mean this one, the Chronograph. It's Mechanism and Repair. Brilliant book for anyone interested in chronographs. Of course, some of the younger viewers might wonder, what is a book? Let's just finish up the wheel train so we can see that everything runs freely. And then when we've done that, we're gonna address the color of the escape wheel cock. Kind of a funny name, cock, I suppose, if you're so inclined. In the French books, they basically just use the same word for both bridges and cocks. But the British always have to have a cock up, I suppose. And we're entering the tiny screw contest with these couple of screws on the crown wheel. Yeah, baby. Give it up, all right. So we'll take the cock off, and we're first gonna treat the escape wheel and the pallet fork with some fixer-drop. I think someone in the comment field asked to see a little bit more about how we deal with the fixer-drop process. You basically soak the parts in fixer-drop for a little while. But some of the discussion online has been on whether it's good for the pivots to be covered in epilam. So basically the same as fix-a-drop. Fix-a-drop is just a trade name for the epilam. And the epilam again is so-called stearic acid. And the stearic part is basically the same as in wax candles. So the theory is that with the pivots being covered by this, you might get residue into the movement. So to get the residue off the pivots before we put it in, we press the pivots down into some pithwood. And now for something completely different. Magic Rhodium. Actually, that's not entirely correct, because it's not magic and it's not rhodium. It's a Horotech product, and for those who don't know Horotech, it's really a fabulous provider of quality instruments and stuff. Kind of wish they were sponsoring the channel, but I'm just a fanboy, I suppose. It is silver cyanide. So for those of you who have read books about spies or Nazis with the cyanide capsules in their teeth and stuff, it smells exactly the same. So it's not recommended to drink. It does, however, work fairly well. What is crucial with it is to really rub it. You really have to rub to get a little bit effect. So pegwood, just keep rubbing and rubbing and rubbing, and ultimately you will get a decent result. It's not going to be brand new and shiny. For that you would have to plate it again. But then again, the rest of the watch is also not that new or shiny. So I think the end result is pretty okay. And with the cock, the escape wheel and the pallet fork back in place, we're going to wind the watch a little bit so the pallet fork moves from side to side. And then we're going to oil the pallets, or rather the pallet. We oil the exit pallet. And then we let 5 teeth on the escape wheel escape. And then we do that 3 times, and then we cover all the 15 teeth on these old watches. So there is a slight benefit of putting epilam or fix-a-drop on both the escape wheel and the pallet fork. The oil or the grease stays a little bit better. And we can see that the watch is eager to start working, so that's always nice to see. Let's oil the pivots, and then we can put this baby on a Timegrapher. For the oil, we use D5 or HP 1300 on the center wheel, and then the rest is 9010. Gonna give it a full wind, and then off to the Timegrapher. Now, this is good. Actually, the amplitude is a little bit too high, but given that we haven't put on all the chronograph parts yet, that will drop a little bit. But still, one thing we saw though is that the beat error is still too high, so we're gonna have to deal with that. Now these old movements, you cannot just move the stud carrier as in newer movements. So you have to actually change the location of the collet for the balance spring on the balance staff. And that is not necessarily tricky, but delicate process. So we typically have to do this a few times. What we want to achieve is to get the beat error within 1 millisecond. Then we should be happy. But dealing with the hairspring or the balance spring is not something you really enjoy doing. At least I don't. It's a big risk of making something happen that you don't want. And we can see that after the adjustment we do get to 1 millisecond. And the amplitude is also slightly lower. For the chronograph parts, we first put on the driving wheel, which is on the extended pivot of the fourth wheel. And we remember that the clutch wheel didn't spin as freely as it should. So I'm going to check that again now. Yeah, that runs much better. So a chronograph like this might look very scary in a sense, but it's actually a rather simple logic behind it. Of course, everything in the watch movement is logical. It is about transferring power from one wheel to the other, basically. And just making sure that the wheel count is such that your hands and so forth return at the correct speed. So in a horizontal clutch chronograph like this one, you first get the power from the driving wheel that's on the extended pivot. Then the clutch takes that power and transfers it to the chronograph wheel. So the seconds hand basically on the chronograph. And every time the chronograph seconds hand completes one revolution is 1 minute, of course. So then there's a little finger that flicks over the minute wheel to make that tick 1 minute forward. Now there is an intermediate minute wheel, and the whole reason for that is to make the chronograph minute hand rotate clockwise and not counterclockwise as it would if there were no intermediate wheel. And then of course you need to have a manner to reset the wheels, the counters. And you do that with a hammer that strikes onto the heart-shaped cams attached to the wheels. With the clutch in place, if we go zoom in, we can see that the wheels are engaging a little bit too deeply. So the so-called depth thing is a little bit too small. Basically, for chronographs, the rule of thumb is that the wheels should engage at 2/3 of the tooth height. And to adjust this, there are at least 3 eccentric screws. One to adjust the depthing between the clutch wheel and the driving wheel. One to adjust the depthing between the clutch wheel and the chronograph wheel, so the seconds hand wheel, if you will. And one to adjust the depthing of the intermediate minute wheel to the finger on the chronograph wheel. The thing is, once you start meddling with one of those, you typically have to start meddling with all of them. So if everything works fine, it's better to leave it alone. So here we're checking to see that everything runs as it should. We basically assemble the chronograph movements in the opposite order. So make sure everything works smoothly and does what it should before we put on all the springs at the end. Looking at the parts, One of the springs also looks a little bit homemade. This one here. So I do think that the same watchmaker probably repaired that as well. Here we have the brake. That one basically stops the wheels from moving when we press the pause button. And here we have the hammer. Alright, with all this in place, we can start putting on the springs. And the springs is actually a big difference between the cam shifted chronographs and the column wheel shifted like this one. If you remember from the 7750 videos, we basically press the different parts to their respective locations, because that's what the cams do. But in a column wheel, all the parts are basically held in place by springs, and then they slip their tail end into the gaps between the pillars when the pillar wheel rotates. So the only pressure on the buttons is to make the pillar wheel rotate. So it's extremely smooth and nice, whereas a cam chronograph can be pretty rough and hard to press. To make sure that the wheels return to zero nicely, we're going to also put some grease on this hard-shaped cams. You can use Molecoat DX. Some also say you can use D5 there, or 9504, some type of grease. So in a column wheel chronograph like this one, when you press the button, you don't actually press the hammer onto the cams, you just release the spring, so it's very important that everything is lubricated properly. We're also going to put some 9010 on the pivot of the chronograph wheel, so the center seconds wheel if you will, but we do not put oil onto the minute counter wheel. That's because the force there is so small that oil might actually drag it down and make it not flip correctly. A little bit the same principle as with the pallet fork. Alright, let's test that it works. For a recasing, one of the buttons is cased into the case before we put the movement in, but the other button we can put in afterwards. As before, we're putting the crystal on top of the dial side while we make sure everything is fine with the movement. That way we protect the dial side. Before we get to the dial, however, let's make sure that the chronograph runs as it should. Try it a couple of times, and then we're going to let it run for 1 minute. And go! And of course, no one actually has time to wait for 1 minute. So let's speed this up a little bit. And we can see the finger on the seconds wheel, the chronograph wheel, there, flicking the intermediate wheel over, which again flicks the minute wheel over, under control by a jumper. That jumper is also a little bit tricky. If it's not placed correctly, the minute hand might not jump, or it might revolve a little bit when you start the chronograph, that kind of thing. What we did now was to oil the pillars on the column wheel to make sure everything also slips smoothly there. And it's cool to play with. My turn. No, no, let me. I want to. Now for the hands, we put the dial back on. We're going to put the hands on very carefully, as this dial is really not going to love it being touched or scratched. And I'm sorry I didn't get any good footage of actually pressing the hands on. Just gonna clean the hands ever so slightly with some Rodico. And as always, we need to check that the hands run parallel with the dial. And for the hour hand, that it doesn't scratch or get stuck onto the sub-dial hands. Of course, I keep saying that this dial is very fragile, and still I use metal tweezers in very close proximity to it. And when I do that with my famous or infamous shaking hands, but still I feel comfortable doing it. Let's see if everything works as it should. Gonna let it run for a couple of minutes. See that the hands flick over as they should. Last thing we're gonna do is just polish the crystal a little bit. Interestingly, it had more scratches on the inside than the outside. And with that, we can put the crystal back on and look at the watch on the wrist. Yeah, look at the watch on the wrist. That is a nice dial, man. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe and commenting would really help the channel. Would really appreciate that. We'll be back again shortly. Promise. Until then. Ta-ta.